Hello, my dear friend. Are you ready for another batch of horror stories? Then let's begin. These stories are true, taken from open sources. Names have been changed, but their terrifying essence is accurately conveyed. Story 1. The Ranger's Warning. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I embarked on the Great American Road Trip. We were going to drive from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging through the heart of the country for 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s, pretty broke and eager for adventure. Since my mum had been a long-haul trucker, she gave me some solid advice. To save a ton of money, she suggested we sleep in the back of our hatchback. It turned out to be a pretty cozy setup. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut one of them up to make curtains for the windows. By the end of the first week, we had gotten so efficient that we could set up camp in about 10 minutes. Luggage moved to the front, curtains up, bedding laid down, and we were out for the night. We slept in parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, basically anywhere that seemed safe and semi-legal. There was never a night after the very first one where we felt scared. That is, until the last week of the trip. We were in Arizona, near Flagstaff, and had gotten pretty used to our routine. We didn't stick to a set schedule and would never drive more than 3 or 4 hours a day. We had no real destination in mind outside of a few must-see landmarks. We drove to places we found the night before on Google, taking suggestions from other campers, locals, and people we met along the way. We had also gotten very good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a group of locals we met at a campsite. We met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar. We played guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm. We were fed breakfast and dinner by a ton of campers who invited us to hang out with them. We even spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was a positive one. This night didn't look to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove up into the woods, following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town, and something seemed a little bit off. When we pulled up to the campsite, there was one RV parked and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV, and a man opened the door. Tez waved hello, and he just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. Then, as if she hadn't said anything, he just slowly closed the door again, staring at us the entire time, figuring he just wanted some privacy and thought we'd be obnoxious. We pulled further down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while it was still light out, we goofed around for a while, smoking and laughing and taking dumb photos of ourselves. Tez pointed out a campfire there, further down the campsite, and we decided to go be friendly. We had met so many cool people in the previous 5 weeks by just going up and offering beer or just chatting. So we wandered over near the campfire. There were 2 men, the owners of the cars we'd seen earlier. They seemed friendly, and we sat down to chat with them. They were drinking and smoking, and we sat down and had a beer with them. One of the men seemed pretty off, and we came to find out that the 2 of them didn't actually know one another. The older man was definitely on something. He was spinning in circles and talking about UFOs. However, he seemed harmless. This left us chatting with a younger man who claimed to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing, and we spent several hours just chatting about our trip, families, and everything. Then he started talking about a bear. He said he'd seen a bear earlier in the forest. Tez didn't believe him, and he pulled out his camera to show her photos of the bear. It was very close to the campsite, and we both were a little freaked out. It wasn't unheard of for one of us to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear hanging around in the night spooked us. The ranger just laughed, and then his expression changed completely. It's hard to describe, but his voice seemed somehow cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." I kept waiting for the laughs, or for him to nudge Tez with his elbow. You know, like, "Just kidding, messing with the foreigners in the city girl, right?" It never came. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. My friend laughed as well and joked about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved on to another subject, but within 5 minutes, the ranger had come back to it. He was talking about something grabbing us from our car in the middle of the night. No matter how we tried to steer the conversation away from the idea of serial killers, he kept latching back on. The older man was high as a kite at this point and was staring at the stars, not talking. We just awkwardly laughed and sipped our beer and tried to get the conversation going somewhere else. Then the ranger stood up and walked towards the cooler to get another beer. At this point, it was pitch black out, and I couldn't see anything outside the circle of light from the campfire. The beer cooler was outside of that circle. Suddenly, there was a red dot in the darkness, and it took a moment for me to realize that it was a camera light. The ranger was holding a camera. He had taken a photo of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera light up. Now, it wasn't odd for people we met to ask to take pictures with us. My friend Tez is gorgeous. Dark hair, blue eyes, like a young Megan Fox. And we were friendly people who liked having pictures of themselves. But it was an entirely strange thing to have this person taking a photo of us without asking or even indicating that that's what he was doing. We were both staring at him like deer in the headlights at this point. But instead of realizing what he was doing was a bit weird, he checked his camera, adjusted some things, and took another photo. This time with the flash. No asking us to smile, no proposing a group photo, and no explanation. After this photo, he came back to the fire and sat down and never said a word about the photo. At this point, me and Tez were mutually freaked out. We made up some excuse that we needed to go set up our campsite and broke out of there. We stood to leave. The UFO guy smiled and said to have a good night. The ranger, however, looked at us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Every hair on my body stood on end. That wasn't alone in my discomfort either, because Tez laughed a response out and pulled me away from the campfire towards our car. We rushed back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing the RV, and jumped in the front seats. My friend Tez was all but hyperventilating. Why did he take pictures of us? I was shaking, and I responded, "I read that serial killers sometimes warn their victims." She stared at me for a second and locked the car doors. Do you think he just took victim photos of us? We were both freaked out. She was in a full panic and turned the headlights on in the car. I immediately yelled at her to turn them off because now he knew exactly where our car was. God knows why. But that is the only night we did not set up camp. We didn't need to tear anything down, so we just put the car in drive and floored it out of the campsite. As we got onto the dirt road, that ranger was walking towards our car with that same cold expression. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. If this is not your first time here, thank you for coming back. Subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss new stories every day. Write in the comments on which topic you would like more issues. Story 2. The Man with the Hanger. It was the summer of 1997. I was 9 years old and scared of my own shadow. So this experience only furthered my fear of the world. My mum and I drove up from Revere, Massachusetts to Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire to camp. My dad was going to drive up the next morning to meet us because he had work. Everything was going normal at the campsite. We set up the tent, built our fire, and all was well. It was still daylight when we noticed that the lone, greasy-haired man in the campsite connected to ours was continually running and leaping onto a wood post. Then he attempted to balance himself on one foot. He kept doing this over and over and over. It was odd, but we just figured he was some lonely kook and had a good laugh at his expense. My mum thought maybe he was trying out for the circus. But then came the nighttime. Absolute darkness, save for the campfire my mum and I were sitting at. We were roasting s'mores over the flames when we heard footsteps approaching from the other campsite. Out of the pines, the lone man stumbled onto our side. He was ghastly and ragged in the firelight. I could tell my mum was tense. She asked the stranger what he needed. "Hey," he mumbled, "I need your help from my campsite." We waited, and he didn't go on. My mum asked what he needed help with. The filthy man said, "I locked my keys in my van. I need you to come over and help me." He then looked directly at me and said, "Don't worry, kid. You can stay here with your fire." I remember getting goosebumps at that. How did he know my name? My mum said, "I don't know how I can help you with your keys. You must have a spare hanger lying around somewhere," suggested the man. My mum told him she didn't. The ghoulish man wouldn't let up, though. "Yeah, you must have a hanger lying around here somewhere. Maybe you dropped one in the ground near your tent." My mum adamantly told him she didn't have a hanger and quickly added, "My husband will be here soon. Maybe he can help you. He's a pretty strong guy." "Yeah, all right," the creep leered. He started to charge away into the dark, but he turned his head and said, "Well, if you do find a hanger, come help me. I'll be here." And with that, this terrible man left. My mum and I barely slept that night. I found her moving at every sound outside the tent. Looking back, my poor mother must have stayed up through the long night, worrying a butcher knife was going to slash through the tent wall. And so, morning eventually came. When we stepped out of the tent, we immediately saw that the lone man and his camper van were gone. Later in the day, I heard my mum exclaim. I ran over to her and watched as she picked something up from the ground beside her tent. She held it between us, staring at it, not speaking. It was a metal hanger. I live in Switzerland now, at the foot of the Jura Mountains. The name Jura comes from the Celtic word for forest, which is fitting considering almost the entirety of the mountain range is covered in woods and pastures. Unlike the nearby Alps, for example, due to altitude, it has a rich history of legends and spirituality, preferably due to the variety of cultures that have inhabited the region throughout history. Celts, Romans, etc. Now, I must emphasize that this story is more on the side of an interesting and creepy encounter than really anything scarier, threatening directly, at least in my view. Growing up, I just saw the Jura as a cool place to explore and admire, going camping and hiking. As I got older, I realized that there was a certain spiritual element to the region, whether that be as mundane as the abundance of churches to monasteries from the 12th century, to more small-scale and personal manifestations of spirituality, which is what I want to touch on today. A few years ago, during bike rides or hikes, I started seeing things like fabrics hung on trees and man-made rock formations. I didn't really think much of it since I assumed it was kids or maybe scout activities. However, as I paid more attention, I realized that these things had more meaning behind them than I had initially thought. Large spiral rock formations at mountain peaks, stone patterns connected trees in a wheel shape in the middle of the woods, pebble markings in the shape of symbols, runes, old world letters, markings on the trees. This is a little striking, admittedly, and a little creepy, considering how foreign and unusual it seemed to me. Later on, I understood more clearly what this was, or at least what some of it was. I started seeing remains of what I now know to be sweat lodges. I don't claim to be very knowledgeable on this, but these appear to be related to the general field of spirituality and shamanism, perhaps of Native American origin. Eventually, I saw a couple of these ceremonies in the act. The way I did was that during bike rides, I would see either a few cars with feather dreamcatcher, bead rearview mirror decorations parked seemingly in the middle of nowhere, or see fabrics tied to trees by the road, and then hear noises further up in the woods. I'm curious, so I had to investigate. The first time I saw a group of people building a sweat lodge, collecting wood, it seemed as if, though they made a makeshift bed nearby, where a couple of people would take naps and rotate. I'm assuming so. They'd be less tired for the nighttime ceremony. I didn't want to bother them, so I kept a certain distance. But eventually, I ran into one of them collecting wood. I greeted him normally in French, and he quietly and politely did the same. He didn't look or sound like a native Swiss, whereas the rest of the group did from a distance. So I've always just assumed that he was maybe their guide or something. Also considering he was wearing these sort of stereotypical baggy maroon clothes. The second time, I'm not sure if it was the same people, but it was a similar sight in a different place. The part that bothered me a bit was that there were a few young kids with them. For those who don't know about sweat lodge ceremonies at all, quite intense and can be unsafe for adults, let alone small children. The ceremony involves making a hut with a pit inside and a fire pit outside of it. Basically, they put large stones on the exterior fire, heat them up as much as possible, then transport them to the indoor pit, and then, I guess, throw water on it and create intense steam. This includes tobacco baggies and herbs as well. As I believe, sometimes some form of drugs. Whether or not they were drugs, the heat and steam has led to deaths and is a draining experience, and I hope that the kids weren't there for that. The day after, I checked on the place and walked around the structure out of interest. It was lots of interesting stuff, like tobacco baggies hanging from the structure, rock formations creating unknown symbols, markings on trees, and creepiest of all, a fairly large piece of bone about the size of a fist balanced on a tree stump. So I won't quite say this was a terrifying experience yet, but it was certainly a fascinating, if not unsettling, encounter, and a new aspect of the area that I simply wasn't aware of before. So we've reached the final story. Thanks for listening this far. Let me know which story you liked best, and please give it a like. I'll keep trying. Thanks. Let's continue. Story 3. The Blanket by the Tracks. Several years ago now, back in April of 2009, if I recall correctly, I had just gotten through the winter quarter. It was the first time I went to college, and I was taking some advantage of spring break. I, along with 3 friends, decided to get outdoors as it was the first truly nice day of the year. I live in Western Washington, and there is a stretch of road that hugs the edge of Bellingham Bay and Samish Bay, north of Puget Sound. It is called Chuckanut Drive. It is a cool stretch of road to drive as it hugs a cliff face for a while and overlooks the water. Along the way, there are a number of turnoffs to get a picture and do other touristy stuff. My friends and I drove up there and pulled into one such turnoff with the intention of hiking down to the water. We wanted to enjoy some lunch, maybe a beer, and just enjoy the day. The weather was perfect, crisp but warm, with the sun reflecting off the bay. Now, the trail we took bottomed out next to a set of train tracks that hug the coastline like the highway above it. This is a relevant detail here, as many transients and other assorted weirdos traveled its length quite often. In fact, we sat on some driftwood on the other side of the tracks, next to the bay, and watched several go by as we hung out. No one bothered us, and we did not bother them, but half of them were completely dressed in things like blankets, and even tarps were a common sight to see draped over them. It gave the place a strange vibe, like a hidden community living outside the rules. We were there maybe an hour or so before realizing that the place was actually way more boring than we thought. We decided to head out and find something else to do. As we were leaving, we spotted what looked like a far better path back up than the one we came down on, and chose it instead. It was where our day took a bit of a turn. Not long after we started hiking up this new trail, we all saw what was obviously a blanket or something wrapped around something else. It was easily enough to see that it was covering something big and solid. It was not as big as a full-grown human, but we knew instantly it was a body. To this day, I can clearly recall how I kept chanting in my own head, "Do not be a child, do not be a child, do not be a child." Walking up to it, we saw that it was not a dead kid, which I am so grateful for to this day, but it was, so sadly, a dead dog. Its head was missing, having been cut clean off at some point just above the collar, which it was still wearing. There was absolutely no blood, and the blanket was still very clean, as though it had just been pulled from the linen closet moments prior. There was no smell from the body either, so I guess it had not been there very long. Furthermore, branches and shrubbery had been cut or pulled free and set up in a way to attempt to hide the body from the tracks, which were maybe 10 to 15 feet away from our location. It was obviously a body dump. Somebody had murdered this poor dog and dumped the body by the railroad tracks, and they had done it very recently. The cleanliness of the scene was what bothered me the most. It felt ritualistic, planned, and cold. At this point, we looked at each other, decided to get out of there, and raced up the steep trail back to the road. We reached my buddy's blazer and burned rubber at the place as quickly as we could. The feeling of being watched returned, even though we saw no one. The woods felt suddenly silent, like nature itself was holding its breath. We later called the sheriff's office about this, but I think they just assumed that a stray dog got hit by a passing train. When we mentioned that his head was missing, the dispatcher went quiet for a moment. We never heard back from them about anything. So I have to assume that either they did not find it or did not look. Regardless, I haven't gone back down that stretch of road since. Sometimes when I drive past that exit, I look away. I think about that clean blanket and the missing head. It wasn't just an animal death. It was a message, and whoever left it there knew exactly what they were doing. The memory of that clean white blanket against the dark forest floor still haunts me. It was the kind of thing that reminds you that evil exists in quiet places, hidden in plain sight, just off the side of the road.